All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back. Ready to dive into some really fascinating stuff today.
Definitely. Always excited to be here.
Me too. Relationships, they're at the core of human experience, right? And how we communicate within them can be, well, let's just say it's make or break time, especially when it comes to couples.
It's true. So much of what makes or breaks a relationship boils down to those everyday interactions, those seemingly small moments where we're trying to connect and understand each other.
Exactly. And that's why we're here today for a deep dive into communication styles in couple interactions. We've got some awesome source material to work with, really eye-opening research that'll help us understand how different ways of communicating can impact our relationships.
The exciting thing is that we're not just talking theory here, we're going to get really practical.
Right. We're going to look at some pretty surprising things like, did you know that even being nice can sometimes backfire in a relationship?
It's true. Sometimes those well-intentioned habits we have, those ways we try to avoid conflict or keep the peace, they can actually create distance and resentment without us even realizing it.
Wow. Okay, so already some food for thought. And speaking of food for thought, our source dives right into different communication styles. It all starts with assertiveness, which is, the gold standard, the holy grail of healthy communication.
Right, the foundation of any strong relationship, really. Being assertive means you're open and honest about your thoughts and feelings. You state your needs directly, but you do it in a way that's respectful of your partner.
So it's not just about being blunt or demanding.
No, not at all. It's about finding that balance between expressing yourself authentically and considering your partner's perspective. It's about being a good listener, too.
Right, makes sense. So, can you give us an example of what that might look like in a real-life situation?
Sure, imagine a couple planning a vacation. One person really wants to go to the mountains, the other is dreaming of a beach getaway. An assertive approach would involve both partners clearly expressing their preferences, listening to each other's reasons, and then brainstorming solutions that could work for both of them. Maybe they find a coastal region with mountains nearby, or decide to alternate vacations, taking turns choosing the destination.
Okay, so it's all about finding that win-win scenario.
Exactly. And the research shows that couples who communicate assertively tend to be happier and more satisfied in their relationships. They feel heard and respected, and they're better at resolving conflicts constructively.
It makes sense. It reduces stress and builds self-esteem, right? Both people feel like they're contributing and being taken seriously. But let's be honest, we don't always get it right, do we?
Definitely not. We're human, we make mistakes, we fall back into old patterns, especially when emotions run high.
And that's where things can get tricky. Because the source doesn't just focus on assertiveness, it dives deep into the less healthy styles that we often fall into, like passive communication, where you constantly put your partner's needs before your own. On the surface, it seems kind of, self-sacrificing, but
But over time, it can lead to feeling unheard, resentful, like your voice doesn't matter. I remember this one quote from the source that really hit home. It said, "Passive communicators often become martyrs in their own relationships, sacrificing their voice for the sake of harmony, but at what cost?"
wow, that's powerful. Sacrificing your own needs for the sake of harmony. I mean, it sounds noble, but there's definitely a shadow side to that, right?
Absolutely. It's not sustainable in the long run.
Okay, so that's passive communication. And then there's aggressive communication, which is, well, there's no other way to put it. It's just plain disrespectful.
It's about control, about overpowering the other person, and it creates an environment of fear and intimidation. Think about yelling, name calling, interrupting, those kinds of behaviors. It's definitely not conducive to healthy communication or a loving relationship.
Absolutely not. It just shuts down any possibility of real connection.
Right. And then we have the sneaky one, passive aggressive communication. So much harder to pinpoint, but it can be just as damaging.
Ugh, yes. Passive aggressive, it's like that undercurrent of anger and resentment that never gets directly addressed, so it just keeps simmering beneath the surface.
Exactly. It's like saying one thing but meaning another, or using sarcasm and subtle digs to express your frustration. The source gave this example of saying, "Oh, sure, I'll do the dishes," again, but with a heavy sigh and an eye roll.
Oh, I know that one. It's like a communication minefield. You never know what you're going to step on.
Right. It leaves your partner feeling confused, hurt, and unsure of where they stand.
So instead of having a healthy, direct conversation about what's bothering you, you're just creating this kind of toxic, unspoken tension. It's crazy how these things can creep into our relationships without us even realizing it. And it's not just the big blowouts, right?
Yeah.
Even small, everyday behaviors can have a negative impact over time.
Absolutely. Think about constant complaining, blaming your partner for everything, using sarcasm to put them down. It might seem insignificant in the moment, but those little digs and negative comments, they can slowly chip away at the foundation of your connection.
It's like death by a thousand paper cuts.
Right.
You might not even realize how much damage is being done until it's too late.
Exactly. And you know what else can be really damaging? Stonewalling. Have you ever done that in the heat of an argument? Just shut down completely and refuse to engage?
Oh, absolutely. Especially when I feel overwhelmed
Yeah.
or like I'm just not being heard.
It's a natural response when we feel flooded with emotion. But think about it from your partner's perspective. They're trying to connect with you to resolve the issue, and you're just shutting them out, building a wall between you.
Yeah, I can see how that would feel like a huge rejection, like their words are just bouncing off a brick wall.
Exactly. It leaves them feeling completely alone and helpless to fix the situation. And this can actually trigger that other really destructive pattern, the cycle of criticism and defensiveness. One person criticizes, the other gets defensive, and the conversation goes nowhere.
Oh, that's so classic. It's like a dance that just keeps going round and round with no resolution in sight.
Right. And these patterns, they become even more destructive when emotions are already running high.
Oh, for sure. It's like adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how these patterns play out in so many different ways, like, that push and pull of the protesting withdrawing dynamic. One person is desperately seeking connection, trying to get their needs met, while the other person keeps pulling away.
Yeah.
And it just creates more distance and resentment.
It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. One person feels abandoned and rejected, so they protest even louder, which just pushes the other person further away. And then there's that urge to get loud, to raise your voice to be heard, but
But it often just backfires, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It triggers that fight or flight response in the other person,
Mm.
and they either shut down or lash out.
Mm.
So you end up even further away from understanding and connection.
Exactly. And then there's the opposite, conflict avoidance, where you constantly try to keep the peace, even if it means swallowing your own feelings and needs. On the surface, it looks like you have a really harmonious relationship, but
But it's like a volcano waiting to erupt, right?
Ah.
All that unaddressed tension and resentment just builds and builds until it finally explodes.
right. So avoiding conflict doesn't actually solve anything. It just postpones the inevitable. And you know what else can lead to unnecessary blowups? Assumptions. We often react to what we think our partner means, not what they actually say.
Oh, assumptions. They're the relationship killers. It's like we create these stories in our heads about what our partner is thinking or feeling, and then we react to those stories instead of to reality.
It happens all the time. Someone says, you never listen. But is that really true? Probably not. Maybe they weren't fully present in that one instance, or maybe they have a different way of showing that they're listening. Instead of getting defensive, take a breath and seek clarification. Say, what did you mean by that?
It's such a simple thing, just asking for clarification, but it can prevent so much unnecessary conflict.
Absolutely. And, so much of this comes down to how we phrase things, the language we use, like that fascinating point the source made about I versus you statements.
Oh yeah, tell me more about that. That one really intrigued me.
It's amazing how a subtle shift in language can make a world of difference. You statements like, you always do this or you never do that, they put the blame squarely on the other person.
It's like an attack. It puts the other person on the defensive immediately.
Exactly. But I statements, they focus on your own experience, your own feelings. Instead of saying, you never listen to me, you could say, I feel hurt and unimportant when I don't feel heard.
Oh, that's so much more effective.
Yeah.
It's less accusatory and more about expressing your own needs.
Right. And it invites your partner to understand your perspective instead of just getting defensive.
So a little tip for our listeners out there, catch yourself when you're using those you statements and try reframing them with I. You might be surprised at the difference it makes.
It's a game changer for sure. And along with choosing your words carefully, the source really emphasizes the importance of active listening. It's not just about waiting for your turn to speak. It's about genuinely trying to understand your partner's perspective, putting yourself in their shoes.
And that's not always easy, especially when you're feeling hurt or angry. But it shows respect, even in the midst of disagreement.
Exactly. It shows that you value their thoughts and feelings, even if you don't agree with them.
Okay, so we've talked about passive-aggressive and passive-aggressive communication. We've talked about assumptions, the power of I statements, and the importance of active listening. Now let's talk about another major relationship killer, control. I think we've all experienced this in some form, either being controlled or trying to control someone else.
Absolutely. It's so common and it can be so insidious because it often masquerades as love or concern.
Right. It's like, I'm just trying to help you, or I'm just looking out for your best interests.
Exactly. But controlling behaviors, even when disguised as good intentions, they damage relationships. Think about jealousy, constantly checking your partner's phone, trying to dictate who they can and can't see, or micromanaging, always telling your partner how to do things, criticizing their every move, or giving unwanted advice even when it's not asked for. It all creates imbalance and erodes trust.
It's like you're taking away the other person's autonomy, their
Mhm.
sense of self, and no one wants to feel suffocated in a relationship.
Exactly. It's about respect, about recognizing that your partner is a separate individual with their own thoughts, feelings, and needs. And that brings us to something really important that we can't ignore: verbal abuse.
Mhm.
Name calling, constant criticism, put downs, threats, manipulation. It's never okay under any circumstances.
It creates an environment of fear and intimidation.
Yeah.
It chips away at the other person's self-esteem and sense of safety. And it's absolutely crucial to recognize that and seek help if you're experiencing it. There are resources available, people who can help.
Absolutely. And one thing that really struck me in this research was the connection between our own that voice inside our heads that's constantly judging us and the way we communicate with our partners.
Oh, wow. Tell me more about that.
Well, it's like this. If we're constantly putting ourselves down, if we have low self-esteem and don't believe we're worthy of love and respect, it's going to impact how we communicate. We might avoid difficult conversations because we're afraid of conflict or rejection. We might be overly critical of our partners because we're projecting our own insecurities onto them.
So our own inner critic can actually sabotage our relationships. We end up pushing away the people we love because we don't believe we deserve their love. That's really powerful stuff. We've covered a lot of ground here today, but the key takeaway is that communication styles are absolutely crucial in couple interactions.
Right. Assertive communication is the gold standard. It's the foundation of a healthy, happy relationship. Being open, honest, direct, but respectful. That's the magic formula.
And we've seen how those other styles, passive-aggressive and passive-aggressive, can really damage our relationships, create distance, resentment, and even lead to abuse.
It's about recognizing those patterns, both in ourselves and in our partners, and having the courage to shift towards healthier communication.
Exactly. And we've learned some really practical tools today, like the power of I statements, the importance of active listening, the danger of assumptions, and the damage of controlling behavior. This deep dive has given you a framework to start analyzing your own communication patterns.
It's about asking yourself some tough questions. Do you see yourself in any of these styles? What impact might they be having on your relationship? And how can you start shifting towards healthier communication? The real work begins now, putting this knowledge into practice for happier, more fulfilling relationships.
Absolutely. And just remember, communication is a skill. And like any skill, it takes practice. But the rewards are so worth it. So keep learning, keep growing, and keep communicating.
You got it.
Until next time, everybody.
Yeah.